Hello and welcome to all of our patrons who are watching live and to all our listeners who are listening after the fact. This is An Act of the Kingdom, a podcast about liturgical worship and how it affects your everyday life. I'm here with my teacher and friend, Father Jeffrey Reddy, and my teacher and soon-to-be friend, Jonathan Pageau, who I've just met here.
It doesn't take long.
It doesn't take long.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, welcome, Jonathan, to the podcast. I think you're a perfect fit for this podcast because we talk about liturgical worship and how it affects your everyday life and how our patterns of worship are more than just what happens in church on Sundays. So for all the listeners and all the viewers, I'll read a bio here for Jonathan so you can know who he is. Though if you're watching this, I'm pretty sure you already know who he is. So Jonathan Pageau, French-Canadian icon carver, public speaker, and YouTuber exploring the symbolic patterns that underlie our experience of the world, how these patterns emerge and come together, manifesting in religion, art, and in popular culture. He's also the editor of the Orthodox Arts Journal and host of the Symbolic World blog and podcast. Welcome, Jonathan, again.
Oh, it's great to be here. I always enjoy doing things that are closer to the church. It helps to make me feel more connected to the community. So
Right. Yeah, so for the patrons who are watching live, feel free to send in any questions you like right through the chat. And then thank you to the patrons who sent in questions earlier. So the main reason why I wanted to talk about ritual with you, Jonathan, and with you, Father Jeffrey, is because I recently read the book Power of Ritual by Casper ter Kuile. And in the book, The Power of Ritual, the market audience, right? His audience for the book are people who are the nuns, N-O-N-E, people who feel a pull towards spiritual practice and even religion and ritual, but don't have a community in which to participate. So he's trying to encourage and to teach his readers to take on spiritual practices, but to kind of make them their own, right? Contextualize them to your own context. And that's a very fascinating topic. But us as Orthodox, we have this idea that rituals actually sort of matter. Like what you do changes how you interact with the world. And the what we've named this episode is, are all rituals created equal? Are all rituals created equal? And I think a good place to start is this first question I have in the description of this episode is it the content or the action of a ritual which gives it its meaning? Is it the content or the action of a ritual that gives it its meaning? I'll give you a chance to sort of jump in there, Jonathan. And I do have an example from his book, but we can get into that later.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand you mean like just acting out something without bothering with the content? Is that what the action part means?
Yeah. So in the book, he gives this example of, he rues the fact that he was forced to learn the Lord's Prayer when he was young, right? Because it's the image of patriarchy and all that kind of stuff. Our Father, right?
Yeah.
But he said, you know what? You can use this prayer, but let's say you're feeling particularly connected with nature. You might say our tree. Or you're particularly connected with your professor. You might say, our professor who art in heaven. And you can sort of adapt the content of the ritual to match how you're feeling that day. And I guess, is it the content or the action that of the ritual? Is it just prayer that's good, or is it the words of the prayer?
I understand the question. I think it's obviously both. It's a boring answer, but it's obviously both that matter, because there certain rituals are appropriate to certain things, and and you have to embody them. They can't just be theories in your mind either. You have to actually perform them. I think that one of the things that's important to understand is the idea of segmenting a certain aspect of reality as being a ritual one, let's say the religious part, and then saying that the rest of our life isn't ritualized, is actually a deep misunderstanding of how human beings engage with reality. Your reality is heavily ritualized. Almost everything you do is ritualized. The way you eat, the way you dress, the way you wash yourself, everything about your reality is patterned according to its purpose. And that's what ritual ends up being. And so the question is rather, like you said, what is the content of our rituals? And let's say, what is the importance they have in the scale of a ritual reality? And so I always tell people that addiction is ritualized. Addiction is religious because it's ritualized behavior that repeats itself. It's almost liturgical in the way that we engage in something like bad habits or addictions. But the content is absolutely necessary. We have to replace bad rituals with good rituals. That's the way we do it. And that's the way you do it even for your kids. You say, clean your room. You say, do these rituals, engage in these ritual behaviors in order to make your life more stable. And so that's the same with spiritual life. You can't address, like you said, a tree in the same way that you address God, and you can't address your professor in the same way that you address God. Although there are rituals for both of those. If you address your professor into a colloquial manner and you treat your professor like your buddy, you might run into a problem. You might run into a problem because you haven't properly ritualized your encounter with, it's a different aspects of your reality. And the same with your friend. If you treat your friend like God, then you're also going to have a problem. If you say our Father to your friend, your friend's going to say, I'm not responsible for giving you your daily bread. Like, it's not my job to do these things for you. And so it is content and practice together necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Father Jeffrey, did you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But if I could jump to Casper Turkal's defense for just a moment, and it's not in any way to undermine what was just said here, but I think the context in which this is coming up. Now, I haven't read his book. I am somewhat familiar with some of the work he's done before around ritual and around, dealing with the nuns and duns in society, and where religion is to be, found today, and religious expression and these kinds of community based groups and involvement in ritual and so forth. The problem, I think, as Christians that we need to acknowledge is that for far too long as Christians we were oblivious to what Jonathan just said. In other words, Christianity under the modern kind of era has become a kind of ideas based phenomenon. So if you're a Christian, if you think a certain way, right, and then you almost paid no attention to the way you lived that out, right? So those rituals that Jonas is just describing, were not actually informed by any of the content of what you maybe went and spent an hour on a Sunday, kind of looking at and paying any attention to the end or the telos, the purpose, of all of that. And so I think what a lot of the people who would identify as the spiritually done or the nuns or whatever had no point of connection for the kinds of things that they're seeking to do. In other words, people are now gathering and doing things in places like makers clubs and Soul Cycle and CrossFit. And what are they finding there? They're finding rituals that are meaningful for them. They're finding community. They're finding opportunities to kind of transform their lives, to find purpose. A lot of these places like CrossFit is where people go when they get a cancer diagnosis because they're going to find community. They're going to find people who care for them, who are going to look after them, bring them meals. That what I'm just describing should be what a church community, looks like. But it ceased to be that. It just became this place where you ascribed some sort of mental subscription or assent to some idea, but then you went about your life as a normal person, being formed, interestingly, by all the rituals of our kind of late modern capitalist culture and everything. You became a consumer and a producer just like anybody else, paying no attention to, what the Christian ritual was supposed to be doing and infecting your life and so forth. So I think, without saying Casper is right about the tree business, etc., because he's not, right, for all the reasons Jonathan just said. But the point of why people are almost like casting about and trying to invent for themselves a whole way of being is because they cease to find it in, kind of traditional Christian community where it ought to have been, And so if we can, we need to take this as a challenge to remarry that content and form in ritual, in worship that is meaningful, that leads to purpose-driven lives, every day of the week, and cascades down through all of those layers that Jonathan was just talking about. Is perfectly true, right? That we make very clear delineations between, the things which we ascribe to God, which is what our theology does for us if we pay attention to it. If we listen to liturgy, we're very clear about what we venerate and what we actually give ultimate worship to, and so forth. So I mean, all that's true. I think there's just a context for Casper's book almost that is a challenge to us rather than something we necessarily just sort of say, well, no, he's wrong, let's move on. I think we need to listen to what these things are doing in our society. And almost, I mean, to me, it's a positive opportunity that we're being presented with. Because if we actually pay attention to what is happening in these groups with people who are doing these things, we have a real window to go in and say, hang on a minute, how about you don't, work so hard at trying to invent all of this. There's this other thing which we have, which has all those characteristics of community and transformation and purpose finding and accountability, etc., that you're looking for. But it comes as a gift. It comes as grace, not something you need to grasp after and force your way into and invent, which is very stressful. And I mean, the same people who are doing all this are the most anxiety, racked people in human history. And God's gift to us of purpose is a grace, and we can receive that and live that in a ritual way that is not actually going to, force us and dement us and deform us in all these other ways. So anyway, so a positive thing about what's going on, but I think we receive it as an opportunity, as our window for, proclaiming the gospel and the story of enacting the kingdom through ritual, through worship that has been revealed as a grace to us.
And I think a book like The Power of Ritual, the fact that it's quite a popular book, I think displays for us that people are searching for some kinds of ritual that will give their life meaning. And I think you're right that we are sort of in a prime opportunity here to show people a good ritual.
Yeah. And there's also an aspect which often in these types of worlds that I think that maybe if you push them a bit, they would agree with you. But there's a sense in which ritual is not only an individualistic thing. There's rituals bind us to others. That's one of the important aspects of rituals. And because rituals bind us to others, it means that you also can't improvise rituals the way that you think you might. You can't decide today that if I walk up to someone and I'm like, well, today I feel like this, so instead of shaking his hand, I'll step on his foot. It's like, no, that's not going to work. There are realities that, like Father Jeffrey said, like there are rituals that are given to us, and there are spiritual rituals, but there are even secular rituals that are given to us, and that we need to understand that it's a necessary part of reality, because it also binds us as communities. It's not just something that you make up on your own for your own, but I mean, there are, let's say, certain rituals that you can make up for yourself, but they're usually not rituals that bind you to others. Rituals like you can decide, let's say, at what time you're going to take your shower and what time you're going to eat. And these are all rituals that you can improvise, let's say, on your own, but they're not, let's say, spiritual rituals are supposed to bind you to others and to bind you to something beyond you. So you can't just make it up yourself. It's not going to function the way you want it to.
Yeah. One of our patrons had asked the question, which is what you're talking about right now. What is the relationship between ritual and tradition? And I think when we talk about ritual, when rituals talked about on a popular level, a lot of it is kind of self-focused, right? What do I do in my life? What are the practices that make me feel connected? Whereas I think what you're talking about is kind of maybe two different kinds of rituals. Maybe the more important ones are ones we do in community, and the ones that are less important we do by ourselves. Is that sort of a way that we could frame it up, or would you kind of juggle that a bit?
It's mostly about the purpose of the ritual. It's also because I mean, you have to understand that my vision of ritual is very, very wide. That is, to me, ritual is just patterning of behavior. And so, it scales all the way down to brushing your teeth and all the way up to basically the Jesus prayer, and attending to the heart and capturing the thoughts. It's like all of these layers are just depending on what purpose that these rituals are turned towards. And I think that the fact doing it this way, I think, is useful in a modern world, because people who want to dismiss rituality, you can catch them and say, well, your world is ritualized. You can't avoid that. And so the fact that you want to remove rituality, let's say at the spiritual level, like in let's say a non-denominational church where they want to remove all rituality at the spiritual level, it's like, no, you still sing songs, you still do things that are ritualized. You can't avoid it. So it's mostly about just embodying it in the proper things in the right direction. So of course, the more you move towards the individual, the more you have idiosyncrasy. that's just a natural movement towards the individual. And the more you'll have also something like what we call economia, right, in the Orthodox Church, where you have a standard of ritual, but then you have applications that are particular to a person. And the higher you go, let's say, the more it becomes something that binds us together and to others. So
yeah, I don't know that the individual community thing is necessarily where that division line would be in terms of importance and non-importance. I mean, one of the big things and big stressors today is that people are actually being asked to invent themselves, right? To determine their own identity, right? That's seems to be the kind of implication anyway of a lot of the kind of liberation, quote unquote, that has been taking place. There's all of the ultimate product of the modern liberalism is this freedom, right? And one of the places freedom has gone in our society is you're now free to be whatever you want. You can choose anything about yourself. Well, I can't imagine anything more stressful or anxiety racked than to have to invent myself. And what a gift it is actually, as an individual, to know that I come from God and I'm in the image and likeness of God. And that gives me, at the very deepest part of my being, a purpose, right? And I can actually rest somehow in that. Now, it doesn't mean I'm without struggle. It's without a journey, without development and so forth and all that, the Christian life attends to. But at the very heart of it, I don't have to invent myself, right? So that's a very serious matter indeed. And I think it's where an awful lot of, this kind of grasping after, doing different things, and we have an answer, to all of that, right? That ultimately that community and individual come together. When you form a person, you're actually only properly a person in community, in communion, when you are, properly in the image of a triune God who is himself a communion of persons, right? So all of that to me is such it's a relief and a peace compared to this idea of, well, hang on, you've got a carte blanche, go out now, determine everything about yourself, your very purpose in life, your sexuality, your gender, your every value, etc. It's all up for grabs. There's no parameters, no constraints, just have at it. Well, naturally people are going to be actually driven to all kinds of things. Jonathan mentions addiction. I mean, you want to numb yourself against the pain of such an awful chasm of a void of meaning and that sort of thing. So I don't think that obviously brushing your teeth is on a different register from who you worship, right? But in terms of the characteristic or the kind of constitution of the individual, that's a serious matter indeed. And so we would, I think, say that there's a seriousness to everything. And as Christians, we're actually asked to attend to almost every aspect of our lives. That's why we have disciplines like fasting, right? We don't say what you eat for breakfast doesn't matter. We make a serious business of that too, because it's all interconnected and ultimately should all be kind of aligned in the direction of our ultimate purpose, which is given to us by the very fact that we exist in the first place.
So I've talked to lots of people who would say something like this, right? And I'm interested to get both of your reactions to this. It'd be something like, well, I get everything that religion would offer me in places that aren't religious, right? Things like community or participation in something bigger. Like an example that comes to mind right now is sports, right? Like sports will offer you everything in a way that the church offers you. It offers you a history. It offers you saints. It offers you liturgy. It offers you cathedrals, in the stadiums. It offers you colors to wear. It offers you kind of all these aspects of our Orthodox life and Christian life in general. And one thing that I'd like to explore now is sort of, well, what does the church offer that sports doesn't offer, right? Like, is there, what more does the church have that is the next step? Well, how does the church take these things and actually orient them towards the truest good that, sports can't do in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, we could take it really like at a very basic level and just be almost materialist, like as low as possible, and not say highfalutin things that, sports. You're right. Sports does offer a ritualized participation in an identity, which has a lot of what you're saying. It has celebration. It has let's say a veneration of excellence, and a tendency to bring people towards excellence and everything. But it's ultimately limited because the virtues that it brings about are limited to that which the sport can contain. And so and those are good, they're a good, but they don't encompass all of reality. And so there are other aspects of reality, other goods that are higher, that are more lofty, that we should participate in for our world, for us as beings to hold together, and for the world to hold together as well. And this is what the church offers. That is, the transcendentals that the church offers are beyond sports. And even just in the fact that sports, let's say sport is represented as a competition. It's a competition. It's basically a kind of war, like a low-key warfare between different groups. And there's value in that, but it's very limited. If you make that your highest value, then you have a dangerous portrayal of reality that you're existing in, which is a world of competition and conflict. And so to, let's say, be engaged in a sport, but then also know that there's something above it. There's a way in which we're all bound together in love, that we're all kind of moving towards the possibility of being the body of Christ, and being united despite our differences, despite our weaknesses, because there's not a lot of celebration of weakness in sport. There isn't a lot of care for the weak in sport. All that stuff isn't there, but you need that as to be able to participate in a higher truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can think right back to, Aristotle, who talks in the first instance about the kind of teleological model of virtue and so forth. I mean, he describes, that everything that has a kind of purpose can have virtue if it's working towards that purpose, right? So a knife is virtuous to the extent that it actually does what it's supposed to do. Its purpose is to cut. If it cuts, then there's a virtue to that. So that operates on every level, right? So we participate at the same time as human beings in all of these stories that have purposes and ends, and therefore all of them have excellences that are oriented towards those ends, and we're doing this simultaneously with all kinds of layers of things. The Christian story, the story of God, the story of the kingdom of God as revealed in the scriptures, as ultimately and finally revealed in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ, and is then participated in through every generation of the church. And we have the exemplars of the saints. We have, the traditioning of all of the aspects of practice that are orienting ourselves towards that end of the kingdom. That's just the biggest story that there is, right? So all those other stories will somehow kind of fold into that. And even that story of athletics or of sports or whatever, it's used in the early church a lot, and even in the New Testament, as a kind of metaphor for certain aspects of that, wider Christian life. And so to that extent, it is good, right? I mean, the metaphor of the athlete, the running the race, or of the wrestling, the combat, the agona, the struggle of spiritual life. These are all kind of taken from, kind of sporting, metaphors. To that extent, it kind of folds into one aspect of that wider story. But it's precisely that. What is the end? What is the purpose? What is the telos? Is what the question that always, comes to mind. And that's why ultimately, as we move out into this space where people are, they are already, because they're human, ritualized. They're already, because they're human, participating in stories that are either, their rituals are either virtues or they're vices, because they're either going towards or away from the end of those stories. But the thing that we can offer is the biggest story of them all, of the narrative that can outcompete all other narratives. And that the story of our world today is not one of an absence of of all of this. It's where there's just been an utter explosion of all of this. This is Charles Taylor's, thesis in A Secular Age, that we've moved to this age not where religion is absent, but where it's everywhere, and everybody, has their own take on it. Well, the biggest story of all is the one that makes sense of the greatest, set of data, and that's everything from creation to the end of all things, and that's the story, that we have, and therefore, that's the sense in which, what we do at the Divine Liturgy in an Orthodox church on a Sunday morning or on a feast day by far exceeds what's happening in your Hamilton Tiger Cats stadium, on game day, much as it has, lots of points of intersection, and it functions, from the model of Aristotle and teleology and virtue ethics, and so it's the same thing that's at work, but it's the same thing that's work when you're brushing your teeth, right? Yeah. Because there's a virtuous and a teleologically driven way of doing that achieves that end. So it scales up, and all these different layers, and we can attend to it with the same thing. I think the thing that's really interesting about having these discussions and being invited into this discussion by what's happening in the world today is that we'd actually stopped paying attention to precisely, how all this was working. So again, we had the idea of Christianity, we had Christendom, we had cultural settlement and so forth. But what we were doing was actually participating unwittingly in all these other rituals and all these other stories leading to other ends, right? I mean, the sports stadium is one thing, but what about the cathedral of the shopping mall, with all of its iconography and teleology and transactions and spiritual transformation, everything? We were co-opted and conscripted to that, far more than we were to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet we wouldn't have identified as consumers as our fundamental identity. And yet that's what's happened. So by paying attention to any of this, it's actually a step forward, right? We can start to almost, do the narrative criticism on the stories of our lives and figure out, okay, who are the real, characters here? What's the plot, who's writing this plot, who's the author that I want to, kind of assent to, and so forth. So I think it's a useful framework to begin having these conversations, but also, I mean, it's the sort of thing we should be taking to confession, Father, I have sinned because these are the stories I've been really paying attention to and the rituals I've been living out towards those ends, rather than living, the fullness of the Christian life. I think that's why I ask people to come to confession with, rather than, lists of, naughty things or whatever. That's not the point. The point is, what are you living in? What story are you participating in? What's the purpose that's driving the kind of unthinking activities, habits, behaviors of your life? Because that's what ultimately will matter, the desires of our hearts that will be revealed at the final judgment.
Mm-hmm. I would love to hear discussion. So there's two concepts keep coming up in our conversation, and it's purpose and freedom, right? That like we as humans, at least from our Orthodox Christian perspective, would say that we do have a purpose, right? A telos, a goal, a trajectory, right? When we look at an icon of Christ, ultimately we're looking at our own telos, our purpose. But at the same time, there's this emphasis on freedom as well. And I'm wondering what the relationship is between freedom to kind of do what you want. Like we as humans have freedom to kind of do what we want, but at the same time, we have a purpose, and which would seem to limit freedom. So I would love to hear a discussion on the relationship between freedom and purpose, and maybe like, do we have to redefine these words? Like what's going on with these two concepts?
I think we do need to redefine these words. I think that St. Maximus, his definition of freedom, I think is just the best definition of freedom, which is to frame it in the way that you framed it would be that the only manner that you are free is when you are moving towards your purpose. That's the only way you're free. And you have to think of it mostly like, if you're moving towards your purpose, then you're moving towards what you are. And if you're not, it means you become a slave to all these idiosyncratic things that are next to you. And so that's the true freedom. So the only true freedom is actually to move and become like Christ, and to move and to be united with God. And everything else that you engage with that isn't moving you in that direction is actually what is a form of slavery. So the idea that I'm free to drink, it's like, no, you're not free to drink, because if you act that way, you'll become a slave of the bottle, and you will experience that as slavery. But when I act in truth, and when I act with virtue, when I act with love, then I am free. I am not bound by these by the exterior, as you'd say, or by the lower goods, maybe a good
Right.
way to think of it that way.
One metaphor that I've heard is, when you plant a seed of a tree in the ground, if you give that seed its appropriate freedom, it will become a tree. Like it won't become a car,
Exactly.
right? It'll become a tree.
Yeah.
It'll be very stressed trying to become a car if you
Right.
ask it to do that, yeah. Or if it decides that's what it is, right?
It'll
Yeah,
have
It'll
an
have to go into
existential
therapy
crisis.
because it wants to be a star.
Yeah, I mean,
Father Jeffrey, take it away.
it's a complicated business because I think in some respects, I mean, Orthodox will emphasize a certain amount of freedom over against maybe a certain strain of Western Christianity that was all about, kind of God foreordaining, predestining certain eventualities, right? So it sort of didn't matter whether or not you chose Christ because that was already determined in the stars somehow. And I think against that, Orthodox will emphasize a certain amount of responsibility to respond to God's call, and that ultimately that call is universal and that we all have that opportunity and everything. But I think where the genesis of that, which is, fundamentally Christian concept, and that obviously leads through stages to what we have in our kind of modern liberal, mindset around freedom. But now this idea of freedom as this kind of removing of all constraints, right? Of removing all authorities today, I mean, everything, all this vast chasm in the political spectrum in our world is actually all in a very narrow part of the spectrum to do with how you actually implement freedom, right? Some people will say, well, it's by taking off all government shackles, that's the freedom we want. The other one says, well, no, government has to be involved to give people the freedom to do whatever they want and to choose whatever identity, etc. So, but it's all about this kind of idea of freedom without constraint of any kind. And I think the insights of some of the stuff we're talking about here, late 20th century, early 21st century philosophy, and looking again at the human person, we understand that's not how human beings are, right? That's all predicated on the notion that you can just kind of think your way into some kind of reality, whereas we're actually formed by ultimately discipline, by power, right? Power structures and disciplines and so forth are what are at work here. And you might think you freed yourself from that, but you are ultimately subjecting yourself to other powers, right? And so the example of the bottle that the alcoholic is subjected to, but whether you're aware of it or not, whether it's consumer pressure, whether it's all the kinds of disciplines and so forth that are attendant upon all those stories that we're participating, we need to be kind of made aware, of all of that. And the Christian answer is not to remove all of that, but to offer proper discipline. We call ourselves disciples, and there's a kind of real purpose to that because it involves power and it involves being subjected to power, but that power is the godly power of the divine, God himself, right? That we're putting ourselves into the right story with the right end and with the right purpose, and therefore we can be formed in obedience to truth, to goodness, to beauty, to everything that we ultimately want. And if we don't pay attention to that, it's not like we're not being formed. We are being formed in all kinds of subconscious ways to things that are ultimately deforming us away from our proper, human nature. So I think it's, freedom as, is there in terms of responding, to God's invitation, but ultimately, as St. Maximus, that quote that Jonathan gave, says, unless the choice that we make is one to be according to our own proper nature and purpose, then we will be ultimately deformed by, all of these kind of counter to God's purposes, disciplines and power structures and so forth in the world around us. But we need to pay attention to them, and that we have to kind of do this analysis and figure out, assume always and everywhere that you are being formed in one way or another, and then to say, well, actually, I'm going to choose the formation that is actually in keeping with who I am. And therefore, the rituals of the church, the liturgy of the church, the sacraments, the ascetical life, the life of prayer and self-sacrificing love, all of this kind of comes together as the community of practice and tradition that actually points us in the direction of a fullness, of a purpose in life that is ultimately, yeah, it's something we can choose. We can respond to God's call for, but it's not that we get every constraint removed, right? We have to be deliberate about the constraints that we choose, obedience to truth and love and goodness, rather than all the other things that we've done subconsciously.
One of our patrons writes, that definition of freedom, mind blown emoji. Love it. Thank you, Alyssa.
It's helpful for now, especially in a debate in a world where people are saying free will doesn't exist and all of this stuff. It's like it really just cuts through all that stuff to use the traditional definition of freedom that the fathers ended up embracing. It's much better, and it's
right.
And remember, our ultimate model for that is Jesus Christ, who is perfectly obedient to the Father. Right.
And sinless, right? Sin does not factor into freedom. Like in his like he was the most free person, but did not participate in sin and didn't sin. So like, I think when a lot of people think of freedom, they mean doing what you want, which means I guess sin kind of factors into their frame of freedom.
Yeah. Whereas, sin is slavery. That's why you can really think of it just almost like in terms of etymology, this idea that sin is to missing the mark. It's missing your purpose. So when is it that you have a purpose and you miss your purpose? Do you feel free? If I'm trying to cook something and I miss my purpose, like I could be free to decide that I'm gonna add cement to my to my sauce, but it's gonna miss the purpose, which is I'm cooking to eat, right? And so it's like there's the idea of freedom, the way we think of it, is just not useful. It's much better to look at the teleological idea of freedom.
It reminds me of Hagrid's rock cakes in Harry Potter. Okay, I do have another question here. Again, this is a question from Sharon, one of our patrons, who wrote in earlier before the episode started. But she just writes simply, is there really any such thing as an empty ritual? And just to contextualize that a bit in the conversation we've been having so far, we've talked about maybe degrees of rituals, like brushing your teeth versus receiving the Eucharist, right? Those are both ritual actions that sort of have one, you can just tell
different implications.
Different implications, yeah. So, but is there? I think us as Orthodox Christians are called to bring God and Christ into all of our rituals, and I'm wondering if I could just get a bit of a discussion on, is there such thing as an empty ritual, or do all rituals orient you somehow, even something as mundane as brushing your teeth?
I think that a ritual becomes empty when it's not in the right position and when it's not in the right place. That's when things appear as empty when they're not in their right place ontologically, you could say, and so if you have a ritual that you make into something that's too important, that's when it becomes empty, right? So washing your hands is a very important ritual, but if you're obsessed with washing your hands and you're OCD about it, then it becomes an empty ritual. It's idolatrous, you could say, an idolatrous ritual. And you can imagine these idolatries as at different levels too. It's just about not having things not in their proper place. If you obsess too much about certain aspects of your life, then they end up becoming something like empty rituals. So I think it's all about placement, which would make it seem empty or not, right? It's like if something's not in its right place, that's when it appears empty, because it's not filling the role that you're trying to make it. You're trying to fill it with. It's like there's nothing wrong with drinking, like we talked about alcohol before. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a glass of beer with friends or at a meal, but that ritual becomes empty when you're up late at night and you're in despair and you're drinking your 40 ounce or whatever you're doing. It's like then that ritual all of a sudden becomes an empty ritual.
Although, I mean, I completely agree with that. Maybe the word empty isn't the right word to use, because it actually is deforming you, right? So the analysis that needs to be done, and social psychologists will tell you that, 95% of what we ever do, we don't even think about. It's just done by habit, right? So, and we don't even attend to that. And that's a kind of scary thing. If we think about, ultimately being judged for how we are in life, if we think that we're acting in a certain way and that's according to what purpose we've determined for our lives, but most of what we're doing is not even analyzed in that regard. So in that sense, there isn't anything empty, because it all needs to be interrogated, and all of it is leading to some story. Now, some of those stories are really petty, some of those are really trivial, and so in that sense, things can be, empty. But I mean, brushing your teeth is important, and the dentist will tell you that, right? And that fits ultimately and can fold into a wider perspective of saying, well, hang on, the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Christianity is not about disembodied souls going to be whisked off to heaven somewhere. It's about heaven coming to earth and joining, heaven and earth together in the temple of creation and so forth, in an incarnational model. So the body is important, and so health care to some extent, although it's less important than ultimate, life as Zoe, is the life of the age to come. So we're not about extending and ultimately obsessing about health and so forth, but it still plays a part in all of that. And so to me, it's about where you need to just attend to as much of this as possible to make sure that everything kind of folds into its right place, right? So brushing your teeth, important, but it's important where it fits into that hierarchy and the priorities of life and so forth. If there's some spiritual and important consideration to be attended to, you can leave brushing your teeth for the moment to attend, to that, because and you've organized and you've paid attention to where all those different purposes kind of fit into that ultimate, thing. But yeah, I mean, I think empty, can have those different meanings, but we really need to pay attention to everything that we do. I think that's one of the messages that we get from the early church, from patristic tradition, that that there's no sense in which our Christianity is just sort of carved out of a part of our life, right? That's the spiritual part of me, that's the religious part of me, and the rest doesn't really matter. The rest is just waiting in some sort of, train station, lounge, waiting for the train that's going to come and take me to some other place, and I can just do whatever I want. No, every part of our life has to be informed and interrogated by the gospel to which we're, committed. So in that sense, nothing ultimately is empty or without need of interrogation and of being looked at and considered within that whole thing. But absolutely empty in the sense of not leading to what our ultimate purpose is, for sure. Yeah.
Well, we have just a few minutes left. So for those who are listening to this as a podcast later, this is going to kind of be the end of this episode. But next week, Jonathan will be joining us again if you're listening. But if you're watching this live as a patron, don't go anywhere. Jonathan's staying with us, and we'll talk for another little while. Before I go, though, I want to end with this question. It's kind of a practical question, I think. I was once at a monastery, and I saw a monk yawn, and he made the sign of the cross over his mouth as he was yawning. So he took a regular, I guess, ritual action of yawning. You might cover your mouth or whatever it might be, and he added the sign of the cross into that ritual. Are we as Orthodox Christians, I guess, supposed to explicitly eventually include the cross or Christian things into all of our rituals? Yeah, I'm just wanting to get your take on that.
I don't think so, but I think that particular example you gave is actually it's a wonderful example, because everybody knows that yawning is a symptom of our fallen nature, you could say. So you could imagine that's why when you go to church, they're always telling you, right, attend, like pay attention, because it is about the capacity to attend. And so
wake up.
So the reason why he does the sign of the cross over his mouth when he's yawning is the same reason why in Western monasteries they carve little grotesques on these I forget what they're called, but they're like these little places where you can put your arm down so that when you're standing, when you're tired, and it's like and the reason why it's like a grotesque is to remind you that this is an image of your weakness. Like, understand that yes, we're giving you a place to rest your arm as a monk, but know what it means. Like, know that it's a sign of weakness. So I think that I think we have to be careful not to bring things in places where they aren't supposed to. Like it would be kind of weird. I think it would become weird, like you said, if you were to cross yourself before you brush your teeth, example, the way we're talking about it. I think that it might be a little dangerous to start bringing it there. But anyway, so that's my opinion. But I mean, who knows? Maybe a saint, maybe like some of these ascetics are able to really actually bring their attention all the way down into the most minute rituals that they're doing. Maybe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, it's already there. I mean, what the incarnation of Christ, which culminates and climaxes in the cross, the death, the resurrection, ascension of Christ. I mean, that already touches every atom in the universe, right? That already touches every event in human history. And so, if occasionally someone does something like that extends it to there, I think that's right. I think it would become trivial if what we tried to do was, turn every part of our life into the divine liturgy, right? If we we spoke to one another in different tones and we dressed up in vestments all the time, or if we like the point of the kind of concentration of ritual in a particular event and at a particular time and space is about rehearsal, a concentrated rehearsal for what will then inform the rest of our life, right? And so I venerate icons in the church to remind myself that every human being is in the image and likeness of God, that I'm seeing the image of God in them. It doesn't mean when I walk out into the street or go through the grocery store, I'm going to bow down and kiss everybody and venerate them as though they were icons, but it certainly should affect the way I behave towards them, right? Mm-hmm. And the way I treat them. And so I think it's in that level that we need to be mindful and extending the ritual, but not as the ongoing, particular rehearsal and stylization and concentration of what we do in worship in that regard. And so, crossing the on is one thing, but if you were to just decide that 5 million times a day you were going to cross everything you were doing, I think it starts to lose its meaning, and that kind of sense of concentration and focus in order to be, it should be affecting everything you're doing without actually having to do that action, if that makes sense.
And here we are, the second half of our interview with Jonathan Pageau. Welcome, Jonathan. Welcome, Father Jeffrey. And I think we should just dive right into it. In this half of our conversation, I really want to talk about, for lack of a better word, syncretism, or people including rituals from various different places into their life, right? And, us as Orthodox like to keep things in-house, so to speak, but to what degree can we participate in rituals that are quote-unquote religious that aren't actually part of our tradition? We're going to go down that road a little bit. I think it's worth still talking a little bit about keeping telos on our mind, the purpose of these rituals. I think and freedom and all that's essential, that we talked about last time. And to dive into this conversation, I'm going to put up a question that Cam Hay has just sent in, which is, so would you say that there is no neutral ground? Either we are on the road to theosis or the opposite. And, in this conversation of ritual, I guess this, the question could be, do all rituals either point us, is it one or two, right? Is it kind of binary? You're pointing yourself towards your ultimate purpose of theosis, or is it kind of destroying you? And I'm interested to get your takes.
I think it's fine to see it that way if you're careful. Like if you're careful to understand that it lays itself out in a natural hierarchy, and so it's like there are certain things that you do that, how can I say this, that are more indirectly leading you towards theosis. Like we use the example of brushing your teeth. Like obviously, you can do that mindfully and you can do it with the right spirit, but it's not, it's not as big of a deal. So I do think that there is no neutral ground, in the sense that there are no things that we do that are purposeless, but the purposes all kind of build up towards something like theosis, but you're not necessarily immediately apparent when you're sharpening your pencil. Like if you're sharpening your pencil, you are ultimately moving towards theosis, but it's not captured, let's say, completely in the act of sharpening your pencil. Let's say, to me, that's the best way to understand that.
Yeah, it's about what I was saying earlier about the way these stories fold into one another and so forth. So for somebody who is ultimately attending to that biggest story of all, right, and whose purpose in life is theosis, as Cam, has rightly, said that, a lot of the things that we can do can actually be taken and folded into that and made part of that. So I can then go with Father Yuri to a Hamilton Tiger Cats game, and I can enjoy the human celebration and the contest and the joy and even the drama with all of it, the U shape of descent and ascent that forms every human story and everything, and I can make that part of that journey. It's not obviously going to be the main constituent of it, but I can nevertheless, as a Christian, experience that in a way that is in keeping with and leading, still pointing in the right direction. But someone else may be there the same day, experiencing the same reality and going the other direction, right? Two of us can go to an art gallery and experience the art in two completely different ways, right? Or watch a film, or cook a meal, or go shopping, and all of that. I think as Christians, it's not that we need to then suddenly exclude a whole range of human activity as though that were not saintly or leading towards holiness. What we have to do is actually recapture and renew every aspect of human reality and live it towards that goal. But if we limit ourselves to any one of those things, then we wouldn't ultimately be living that. But so I think as Christians, by all means, enjoy literature, enjoy music, enjoy art, enjoy sports, enjoy I think there's a lot to be said, and even some of these things that we pointed at in the world today with rituals, some of them are around fundamental things like nature or food or human connection and so forth. I mean, all of that ultimately we need to reclaim and show that the best way of enjoying all of that is to fold it into the biggest story of them all, and to enjoy them in and through and for the pattern of Jesus Christ, in humanity, as showing the ultimate purpose, of all things. There's no better way to be a gourmet cook than to be a Christian, right? There's no better way of being, a fan of the Lord of the Rings than to be a Christian, and some of these things are easier than others to kind of make work. Tolkien works in a way that maybe some other authors don't, but almost nothing is off the table in some regards, as long as it's lived, towards the kingdom. I mean, even something like this big issue in our society today of sex, the best way of enjoying sex is to be a Christian and to live that according to what has been given to us in the parameters. It comes back to our question earlier about freedom and constraint and so forth. The freest way of enjoying sex is to be a committed, married Orthodox Christian and having a family and so forth. So in that regard, I would say absolutely that there's nothing that is particular in terms of there's no the question about neutral ground, right? So it's what you ultimately will put it into in terms of purpose that makes sense of almost any activity. Some, of course, being very trivial, but some being rather important indeed.
Mm-hmm. So for the purposes of this episode, I'm going to play the character who wants to experience religion and spirituality, but maybe keep the church at an arm's length, right? And then as we go through the conversation, I'm going to paint new situations and we can kind of talk about it. So, I can imagine a person who would say, we did talk about in the last episode about sports, right? And sports is kind of one way of enacting kind of religious practices, but without that story, right? It's a limited story. So what about somebody who says, okay, well, I don't only participate in the story of sports, I also participate in the story of shopping and the story of CrossFit and the story of Harry Potter and the story of Comic-Con. So yeah, I don't only have one story, I actually have lots of stories. And all those stories together can come and give my life kind of a holistic meaning and purpose. Yeah, how would we, I guess, as Orthodox Christians, start to address that? Maybe layering these stories, like maybe combining all these stories, make a big story or something like that. I don't know. I'll let you take it away from here.
Well, you can look at the way that the world is the way the world is happening now is really, there is a sense of hodgepodge and a sense of chaos. And so this is not arbitrary. That is the chaos that we're feeling and the disconnection that we're feeling amongst individuals, communities breaking down, families breaking down, the suburbs as an experience of living somewhere without knowing your neighbors. All of these are in some way they're a symptom of a general breakdown of Christianity, or the Christian story, the hold of the Christian story on our lives. And so, when people try to create these hodgepodge versions, and you see it the same in New Age, and you see the same in all kinds of different aspects of the contemporary world, it's really just, it's increasing the breakdown. It's participating in the breakdown. So someone might hate their suburban isolated life, but then they want to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and have a bit of this, and have a kind of bouillabaisse of religious practice. But they don't realize that those two are symptoms of the same problem. And so what the church offers, and what Christianity offers, is a way to ground all the other things in something which is a true binding in love. That is, reality is bound together into this highest attention that we give towards the source of all reality, and the incarnation as the anchor, which makes it possible for us to be attentive to that. And then everything else kind of lays itself out naturally. But if you remove that, then you end up with Frankenstein stories, like all this chaotic mixing, and it does, I think it just ultimately is going to participate in the breakdown, the continual breakdown.
Right. Like before I have you jump in, Father Jeffrey, I do want to read this quote from Caspar Terkeil's book again, because he writes, my hope is that you'll join me in choosing a text of your own to treat as sacred, something you already love, that you already find yourself turning to again and again. We can all benefit from the ancient practices of sacred reading. But he sort of contextualizes that with, well, you pick a book that works for you.
It's like you can't have radical individualism and let's say teleological purpose at a larger scale. You just can't have the two at the same time. So if you encourage this kind of weird radical individualism where everybody makes up their own religion, and then you at the same time complain that everybody's lonely and nobody's able to be in a relationship anymore, and to have families, like all these things are going together. And so it seems like the desire to create idiosyncratic rituals is it's just a continuation of the same problem that they're trying to solve by creating these rituals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Father Jeffrey?
Yeah, no, all very true. And I think our point of engagement with all of that, can be to ask people, what is the purpose, right? And I think often that kind of hodgepodge that we experience is people's attempt to almost numb themselves against the ultimate question, right? Why would they participate and give themselves over to so many disparate, chaotic, certainly not oriented in the same direction stories? I don't think they're even wanting to pay attention to that fact, because they're just trying to numb themselves through all their various kinds of activities and the stories that they participate in, from even asking the question, okay, what is this all going towards? Because any one of those stories might have an end, but those ends are limited. They're framed by this life, and not in any way sort of pointing beyond that. Or if they do, it's to some kind of highly individualistic conception of all of that. So there's, I think, a point of questioning, of genuine curiosity. So tell me, what does that mean about the ultimate purpose of your life? What are you giving yourself over? What do you value out of all of that? And that can start a conversation. Now, the trick here is that as Christians, we need to actually have a good grip on what it is that we have given ourselves over to. Because I say, for far too long, it's just been a kind of, okay, I'm Orthodox because, I can pronounce the Nicene Creed, or I believe in, the ecumenical councils, or, I know where to draw the line between who's Orthodox and who's not Orthodox, as though any of that was, ultimately what's at stake here. Well, we need to be able to say why we want to make the pattern of the life death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus Christ, the pattern of our life, why we are baptized into his death and resurrection, why we put on Christ, what that means, for us. And ultimately what that reveals about every human being and the purpose of every human being. And ultimately the story we have is a really compelling story. And if people, if we can engage and ask people, what it is that they think all of that means about why we're here and where we're going, all these deep questions that people have been asking forever, but people stopped asking because they numb themselves to them. We actually have a really interesting, and a far more compelling narrative than all of these others. I think it's a real opportunity today, this kind of breakdown, right, into, I see it the way, T.S. Eliot wrote about in The Wasteland, right? I mean, there's just kind of fragments of all of these things that are broken down that we're surrounded with. But as he points out in the very end of The Wasteland, I mean, there's underneath, the kind of desolation, there are these deep rivers that are running and everything, and we need to kind of tap into those with wells and be the kind of source for renewal here, and for kind of talking about all these things. So absolutely, the people are doing the right thing if they're thinking about this, but we need to push them to think further, deeper, and more fundamentally about this, and realize that the imminent frame ain't so interesting, after all, if that's all, although people have kind of satisfied themselves to some extent, right? It's another Charles Taylor insight in terms of where we're at today. People have to some extent answered some of those questions by just thinking in terms of this life, and so it's not that people going around with that Jesus-shaped hole in their hearts that evangelicals used to talk about, right? We just need to plug in the right thing. That's not what I'm talking about. Well, we actually need to have a deeper conversation and to get people to kind of ask what it is that all this is about, and to be ready with the answer that we should be prepared to give about the confession of our faith, which I think too few Orthodox Christians are actually prepared to do, to speak to that story, to that purpose.
All right, so you've convinced this fictional person that they need to be connected with, let's say, the Orthodox Church, right? But could they possibly still, I don't know, maybe during the week, one of their practices of spirituality might still be to do, let's say, the Sam Harris meditation app, right? Where it's like you're participating in practices of meditation, but you go to church
Why
on
does this
Sundays.
keep coming back at me? This Sam Harris thing. Like, I keep hearing everybody talking to me about the Sam Harris meditation app. Sorry.
Yeah, I just tried to pick the most atheistic.
No, it's
one.
a good pick. It just happens to be that even if I wasn't a Christian, I couldn't imagine meditating with his voice in my ears. It would just be crazy to do that.
Right. It could be that one. It could be Headspace.
Sure.
It could be whatever. But like the point being, to what degree can you bring in practices of other religions in your participation in the Orthodox life? And I guess the example I'm bringing up particularly is meditation, which perhaps I think people see it as kind of more neutral or baseline, or even atheistic, so you can put your own meaning on top of it, perhaps. Though I don't necessarily subscribe to that way of looking at it. But yeah, I'll just get your take on this fictional person's journey into the church.
Well, I think that, for example, I understand people's desire to meditate. Once in a while, if I'm talking to non-Christians, I'll tell them, like, it's better to do that than to do nothing. Like, it's definitely something, because we have a tradition in the church of attention. We have a tradition of silence and attention. We have a tradition of repetitive prayer and watchfulness, of the heart. And so that's not meditation, but meditation has, how can I say this? It's like, meditation that is a little bit of what we're trying to attain. And so I feel like for some people it can be helpful, but it's like, if you're Orthodox Christian and you have the Jesus prayer, why would you meditate? I don't understand why you would even do that. You have something far superior, and something that is also completely integrated into your tradition, into your belief about Christ, about Scripture, about all these things. And so I don't see why you would even want to do something else. It seems like the fact that you would want to do these other type of meditation exercises is a sign that you don't understand with the richness of what you have. And so I think, and it's like, I can get it. I get it for people that are in a kind of, like I said, like non-denominational type Christianity, where they didn't even have an idea of like attention and capturing the heart and capturing thoughts. And so they're like, oh, well, this yoga stuff's really interesting, or this meditation is really interesting because it helps me. But for the Orthodox Christian, we have it all there. We have everything. I think all the mystical practices that are necessary for a human being are part of our tradition. So I don't see why you would need something else.
We just don't have the app.
Yeah, we don't have the. Well, I have an
You
app
think you
for
get Sam
readings.
Harris
Like,
to read the
I have
Jesus
an app
prayer?
for like the daily readings and stuff, and the daily celebrations that I use. You know,
Father Jeffrey, did you just say having Sam Harris read the Jesus prayer for
Well,
you?
is that what you have in mind?
oh my goodness,
What would his fee be?
what a
Yeah.
nightmare!
No, that's precisely right. I mean, there are counterfeits to everything, that's good. And if you're coming in one direction, they can be the signs, the kind of the shadows that kind of lead you in an ascent towards, what's good. But once you have the fullness, you're hardly going to, swap out, that for something else. Although from time to time, because people don't apprehend and comprehend our tradition especially well at times, it's sometimes those counterfeits that can be the thing that point us back towards the reality of what we're supposed to be attending to. So, for example, we talked about this in the wider sense of ritual, right? So, I mean, we have within the Orthodox liturgy and festal services and cycle of service and everything you need to ritualize the proper way of being a human being. But it's taken people like Caspar ter Kuile to remind us of the kind of purpose and fundamental reality of this, and the kind of theological anthropology at stake here, but not because we're now going to follow Caspar ter Kuile into doing the things he suggests, but so that we can return and understand in a more proper way what it is we're actually already supposed to be doing. I had an example of this recently with one of my parishioners who had, I guess, flirted with Buddhism at some point before he'd returned, to the church. But he said to me one day, Father, I really find the Buddhist understanding of sin much more helpful for me. And I said, well, can you tell me a little bit more about this? And he said, how Christians think of sin as just kind of the list of things that are wrong, that God wants to be angry and punish you for. But in Buddhism, it's more like a kind of aspect of non-functioning human being. It's kind of unhealthy, rather than, I sort of said, okay, well, let's talk about that, because actually what you found in Buddhism, and I'm not saying to go and find it there to anybody, but what he found in that was actually a lens to recover what actually Eastern Christianity says about that. So we looked at church fathers, and we recovered the right thing, because we found that the counterfeit aspect of it was pointing us back to the right thing, because he'd misunderstood, something in his formation, something, in his background had made him understand sin in this kind of very legalistic, framework, which is all too common, right? So in that regards, the counterfeit is a useful sign or prophetic, pointing back into something, but not because it wasn't there in the first place. It's just because we ceased to see it in the right way. So
I think you do have a point, because you can see if you read the early modern, some of the early modern Orthodox writers, right, they're extremely hostile to hesychasm, for example, right, and they talk about this breathing stuff. It's horrible. Like, why are you doing these breathing things? And it's pagan, and it's all these things, and they didn't. And like, almost like it's superstitious to do this, and so it's like, okay. And it's interesting now that we reach this point today where all these cognitive scientists are talking about breathing, and all these cognitive scientists are talking about attention, and so it can help maybe some of the Orthodox to have a few tools to say, hey, look, we had this, and we tried to kind of to push it away from our tradition, but this is real. Like, this is a real thing that we had, and now maybe we have some tools to help us understand why these monks were doing that and how it's important, and maybe we can recover some of the lost aspects of these traditions that were kind of tossed to the side a little bit. Yeah.
All right, so you've convinced this fictional, this fictional character.
Pretty easy to convince your fictional character.
Yeah.
Not to use the Sam Harris app, right?
Yeah. She or he will not use the Sam Harris app, and has decided, okay, you know what? I really do need to focus all of my ritual action within kind of the story of Christianity and those practices. But you know what? My friends go to this big evangelical laser light show, smoke machine, Hillsong service Wednesday nights. So, I'm as part of my Orthodox life, on Wednesday nights, I'm going to go and experience, I'm going to go worship in that context. And then Sunday mornings, I'm going to come and, receive the Eucharist and be part of the Christian community. Thoughts?
Oh my goodness. This is like a really pastoral question, Father Jeffrey. You have to start with this one.
I mean, I think a lot of Orthodox would hide behind canons or something like this, right? And say, that this just shouldn't happen. But I think it's more important to kind of ask, why would canons advise against, this kind of flirting with things, even if that group on a Wednesday night weren't out and out heretics, as it were, so the idea of praying with heretics, is obviously canonically verboten. But I think, again, I would want to have a conversation with that person and just sort of find, okay, what is it that you're finding there? Is it companionship and the kind of relationship with your friends? Maybe that person's come out of that community, decided to become an Orthodox Christian, has joined themselves to that, but it still has friendships. I mean, that's one, possibility. The other, no, there's something I'm missing on Sunday morning and I'm finding it there. Well, that would be a whole other, kind of conversation that would be, worth pursuing. I mean, to that first one, I would say far too often people become Orthodox and just kind of cut off all relationships. And it's very sad, actually, because, the opportunity to kind of continue to influence and to be part of, people's life and so forth, to share with them the richness of what you found in the apostolic tradition of the Orthodox Church is lost, because you've kind of cut off all things. But it doesn't necessarily mean you participate fully and everywhere in everything that they're doing. And so I think that's where the conversation would need to be had there. But I would be disappointed indeed if somebody felt that the divine liturgy wasn't the fullness of worship and indeed of human personhood in that regard. I mean, we are created to worship God, and so what are we doing in the divine liturgy but perfecting that aspect, not aspect, but that fullness of what it is to be a human being, to be priests of creation, that self-reflective part of the created world, offering back to God everything that he has shared with us. So there can't be anything more than that. And if it's just, well, I like the beat, I like the kind of lights and the show and everything, well, possibly that's just enjoyable on the level that we enjoy music or whatever else. As we were saying earlier, you can participate in a variety of things and redirect them towards the right ends. But if the Wednesday night thing was becoming the worship counterfeit, then that's a problematic thing. And I think that's where the canons are wanting to kind of steer us away from, is having kind of concourse with things that are not ultimately the fullness, right? I mean, if sin is anything that falls short of the mark, it is sinful to do and settle for things that are not the fullness, right? And so that's where I think the pastoral kind of question would lie.
And I think it has to do with this hierarchy of goods, or this hierarchy, normal hierarchy of things that, you could say that ultimately what you should be doing, and not should, but like ultimately the ideal would be to do all the hours and the matins, and your morning prayers and the vespers, and, wake up in the middle of the night, to do. And so it's like, that's the ideal. And that's what but most of us are not there, and most of us fall short of that. And so that's also part of reality. And so I would, like that person, that say, if someone would object to someone going on the Wednesday night to go see like a Christian concert with whatever, but then will accept to go see some secular rock band at a club, I'd be like, well, and they'll say, well, I'm Orthodox, I don't pray with heretics, but then I'll go to a concert here. It's like, okay, dude, there's something about the way you're organizing your hierarchy which is a little difficult, let's say. So I would rather someone go to a Christian concert than go see some death metal band at a club. Let's say it that way.
Yeah, I remember I was a teenager and I was in the car and I was driving and my dad was next to me. My dad's a Ukrainian Orthodox priest, and I had on, because I picked up my dad from somewhere, I had on some kind of Christian like metal, right? And he was like, what are you listening to? Like, what is this? So, well, it's better than normal metal. It's Christian metal. I don't know if it was better or not, but that's just what I said.
Yeah,
And
sadly, it's often not musically better. Is that
Right.
the problem with
Yeah.
a lot of these things?
No.
Very rarely. Yeah. Well, you've convinced this person. They are now fully, Orthodox, doing the Orthodox rituals and all that kind of stuff. But we had Father Jeffrey and I had a conversation. I don't remember when we had this conversation. We talk all the time, but we had an episode called Orthodoxy as Idolatry, right? And it was, the misuse of Orthodox rituals and things like that. And I'm wondering, maybe this person has now fully committed themselves to being Orthodox, but they are now perhaps, I don't know, like struggling to figure out how to use these rituals properly, and perhaps going down that road of maybe even beginning to abuse some of these, maybe unknowingly. What are some guardrails that we can use in terms of the rituals that we do to know, maybe what can we do to make sure we're on that straight and narrow path in terms of using these rituals and participating in these rituals responsibly and properly?
I mean, I would say you definitely have to stay in relationship to your hierarchy and to your spiritual father, because often people who go too much on that side, it also tends to be idiosyncratic. It's like, I'm going to do all these spiritual practices, I'm going to do all this, I'm going to do all that, but they're not part of it. They're not doing it in communion with their confessor. They're not doing it in communion with their spiritual father. I think that would actually probably be the best guardrail against that kind of abuse, would be to obey your confessor, obey your spiritual father. And usually, I think most, not always, you'll have exceptions, but most will tend to temper, especially a new convert or someone who's always suddenly super zealous and is going overboard on the other side. I think that tempering will tend to happen at that level.
I think the confusion comes in when means are taken for ends, right?
Yeah.
And so it's exactly what Jonathan just said. We need to be in that community, in the right place, under, spiritual discipline and so forth. And hopefully that is what will provide the right balance in terms of, why do we do these things? Prayer and fasting and the Jesus prayer and simple life and all that. These can become obsessions on their own and become the very purpose, which is to miss the point, right? The only reason we do Christian discipleship, isn't to necessarily think or even to be seen to be doing the right things, but to become and to take on the person of Jesus Christ, right? To be formed into a certain kind of human being, exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, loving God and loving neighbor, doing the mission of God, in the world. And that's, if we orient ourselves to that and do these things, then it's not that we'll never go wrong. It's that we will know when we've gone wrong, and we will know to recorrect, right? And then we're in the pattern of what we find in the fathers of, we fall down, we get back up, but we know to get back up because we know we've fallen down in the first place. So often, if we are focused on the wrong things, then we're not even aware of where we've kind of fallen short. And in so many ways, the last couple of years of what we've seen in our society has been a kind of apocalyptic moment. It's lifted the veil on an awful lot of what Orthodox have been doing and practicing and focusing on, and it hasn't always been the right things, right? So we haven't always and everywhere been doing what we've been doing and guarding and safely passing down generation to generation all these practices. But have we been obsessed with them for their own sake, or for cultural reasons, or for whatever else? Or have we been doing that because we're image bearers and kingdom bearers in the world, and trying to fulfill the fullness of what we're called to be? And I think it's that question that we need to kind of get right. And I say that's the diagnostic tool for when we get it wrong, which will be always and everywhere anyway. But we'll at least know to correct our courses and to get back up, and the ongoing life of repentance becomes one oriented towards our ultimate purpose, right? And so I think that helps us from making these things idols, which they oughtn't to be. I mean, anything good, anything we replace God with is an idol, right? So even all the aspects of our tradition, including our worship and rituals and spiritual disciplines, can be idolatrous if they're taken as ends in themselves. I mean, that's what St. Augustine talks about, right? In terms of, everything can be, a thing in and of itself, or it can be a sign. It can be that thing, that symbol that points us towards God. And even all the beautiful things that we have in our worship and Christian and church life are meant to lead us to God and not to be the things that we worship ourselves.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that's come in from one of our patrons, Esther. Please comment on the Orthodox tradition legacy versus the Lone Ranger pastor who is obligated to invent services and electionary. This is stressful, but could also easily feed into one's own agenda. Go ahead,
I mean,
Jonathan.
definitely this is the problem with idiosyncratic spiritual practice, is that you don't have anything to check you. You know, it's like, so for example, I mean, in the Orthodox, one of the things that tradition does in the Orthodox Church is that, you know, you can have a priest up there who says something that is completely horrendous in the homily, and everybody has had that experience. But then when he goes back to the prayers that he's going to say, then it corrects him, like almost naturally, by the fact that it's kind of contained in this tradition. So I think that that's one of the important things, even in our own spiritual life. That's one of the reasons why the idea of the hodgepodge spirituality that doesn't work, is because we end up making our spiritual life in our own image. And if we do that, then we're not getting better. We're not moving towards an ideal. We're just going around in a circle. And that's one of the problems with kind of auto-declared pastors or these kind of self-declared spiritual authorities, is that they have nothing to check them. They have nothing, even for their own spiritual sake. They have nothing to kind of to check their behavior and their rituals and their prayers and everything.
And if I hear what you're saying correctly, you know, there is that aspect that if you just invent it for yourself, you're going to create it in your own image. The metaphor you could use is like, well, you get a new job and it's a technical job where you have to learn how to use a tool. And when you start first doing it, you don't really know what you're doing. You actually need somebody there who can be like, actually, this is how you do it. And you need to practice it so that you can actually advance and then use the tool properly. But on the other hand, I think, you know, we are supposed to contextualize our faith in our own lived context. And I guess one of the guardrails there that you mentioned would be something like our relationship with our spiritual father or father confessor, and with our participation in the community. So I guess I'm thinking out loud here, but I'll let both of you react to it. But it's sort of like there's no such thing as like a Lone Ranger Orthodox Christian, right? Like
on the internet there is, but not in reality.
Yeah.
Right.
Go for it, Jeffrey. Let you.
Yeah. So, I mean, the complexity, I think, from the Orthodox perspective, I mean, I completely agree with everything Jonathan said. I've even been in that situation of preaching and where I'm held by the liturgy itself, right? And I mean, it's not that I wanted to say something that was outside of that, but I'm just very conscious in preaching that, you know, I'm actually in some ways just taking and paraphrasing the words of the liturgy itself. And that just comes so naturally because we prayed it so many times. And that's a good thing. And the liturgy itself is just rearranged scripture in the first place, right? So all of that is just this beautiful textual tradition that I'm never going to run out of things to say, because I'm just held lovingly, you know, by this kind of reality. But I can't imagine how stressful it would be to kind of have to invent ideas and so forth on one's own. But I was going to say about, you know, the complexity of being Orthodox is that we do have, you know, a deep tradition, a very wide tradition, and it's a very Catholic tradition. And so there can be a sense in which, you know, you can almost become a Lone Ranger within that somehow. And I think we have to be on the watch out for that. And that's where, to some extent, we're seeing that because of this internet and social media phenomenon and so forth, that people can almost select, you know, within that and put too much of a focus on one part and then therefore ignore the rest. I think one of the most helpful things to do for any Orthodox Christian is to visit widely, you know, go to traditional Orthodox countries, go to monasteries, go to different parishes, experience Orthodox widely, to absolutize one instance, one kind of instantiation of Orthodoxy, maybe one pastor or one homilist or one author or one church father or whatever, is to miss that breadth that is itself a kind of counterbalance. The same way we're talking about the liturgy as a counterbalance to the person trying to speak within it, but that breadth of tradition, right? You know, that beautiful example about hesychasm, you know, where, you know, for a time the church was quite resistant to Palamite theology. You wouldn't believe that today, right? Based on a kind of revival of patristic tradition and hesychasm in the 20th century. But for centuries, in fact, hesychasm was looked quite down upon. Well, that was the kind of example of a deviation that was not yet counterbalanced by that breadth of tradition. And I think that's something that we really need to lean into a little bit more. The internet does not help, right? Because it is all about niche. You know, if I only am interested in golf, then I can watch golf on TV or on the internet all day long, right? And I'm not even aware of the greater reality of athletic competition and sports and so forth. So too in Orthodoxy, you can be like this very narrow version of it, which is not ultimately, you know, the Catholic Church that we belong to. And so I think that's a thing that needs to be watched out for. It's not just outside the church that we find these lone rangers, we find them within as well.
So should we tell people, you know, don't only listen to us, you got to go listen to a whole lot of other
Absolutely.
people?
Not just one podcast, many podcasts for you.
Well, I think that
especially Symbolic World.
There
exactly,
you go.
Exactly. Works perfectly to transition into giving you an opportunity, Jonathan, to just give a little bit about your YouTube channel and the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago now, I found myself in a strange place that Father Jeffrey participated in putting me in, by the way, you know, because
Blame me.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's great. It's really wonderful. Like, I'm happy. I'm really grateful all the time. I've ended up in a space where I'm talking to a lot of post-secular people, we would call them, or, you know, people coming out of atheism, or people who grew up Christian, moved away from Christianity, and now are reconsidering Christianity. And so I've kind of found a way to talk to those people, and it seems to have some effect. People, you know, I'm seeing a lot of people kind of reconverting, and a lot of people actually going to the Orthodox Church. I'm hearing that from, especially in the United States. I know a lot of people are saying there's like this wave of catechumen. Obviously, it's not just me, but it's like, I think I'm part of a movement or something that's happening where all of a sudden people are becoming aware of the power of mystical Christianity and the power of what the tradition offers. And so it's been great. I'm really enjoying it. And people are interested. I talk about all kinds of things, from the scripture to the church fathers to commentaries on movies, commentaries on social commentaries on what is happening right now.
Mm-hmm. I've had 3 inquirers email me this week, and in talking with them, all three of the inquirers said, name dropped you as a reason they
Part
were.
of, let's say, one of the reasons. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, glory to God is all I can say to that, because, you know, it's nothing that I planned. Like, I didn't plan to find myself in this situation, and hopefully that it'll continue to be for the best, let's say.
Yeah, so thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to the patrons who were able to watch this live. That's about it. We'll see you next time. And Jonathan, we'll have to have you on sometime in the future. I know that Cam sent in a request for topics here, but it just didn't quite fit. He's looking into the topics of the relationship between beauty, freedom, and ethics. So maybe we'll have to have you on sometime.
Yeah, read The Ethics of Beauty if you're interested in that question. It's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll see you all next time.
All right.
Thank you.